Ragnar Crosby stood by the expansive window of his grand estate, gazing out at the frozen landscape that stretched endlessly before him. The snow-covered mountains loomed tall and silent, their imposing presence a stark reminder of the harsh, unforgiving world outside. At 76 years old, Ragnar had built an empire from nothing, rising from the ashes of his past to become one of the wealthiest men on the planet. His life was a testament to ambition, intellect, and relentless drive. But despite the vast wealth he had amassed, there was one thing he could never buy: peace. The mansion, a sprawling fortress of stone and glass, was a marvel of modern architecture, blending seamlessly with the ancient wilderness that surrounded it. Inside, it was filled with treasures from around the globe, priceless artworks, rare artifacts, and cutting-edge technology. But for all its grandeur, it was a hollow shell, echoing with the emptiness of a life lived in solitude. Ragnar's wealth had brought him everything he thought he wanted, but as the years passed, the realization dawned on him that he was, in many ways, poorer than ever before. The people he had once loved were gone, and those who remained in his life were kept at a distance by the walls he had built around his heart. Every day he was reminded of his solitude, each breath a reminder of the void that no amount of money could fill. On this particular evening, the sky was painted with shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, biting at the skin, and the first stars of the night began to appear, twinkling like distant beacons in the vastness of the sky. As Ragnar wandered the grounds of his estate, seeking solace in the embrace of nature, he noticed something unusual. By the wrought iron gates at the edge of his property, there was a figure, a small, hunched form, barely visible in the essay. Ragnar's curiosity was piqued, and with slow, deliberate steps he approached. As he drew nearer, he saw that it was a woman, curled up on a bench, her body wrapped tightly in a threadbare coat. Her hair was matted, her clothes tattered, and she looked as though she had been fighting against the elements for far too long. "Miss," Ragnar called out softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. There was a moment of confusion as she looked around, trying to read. Her gaze finally settled on Ragnar, and for a brief second fear flashed across her face. She tried to rise, but her limbs, stiff from the cold, betrayed her. "Please, don't be afraid," Ragnar said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to harm you." The woman hesitated, her eyes scanning him warily. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to trespass. I'll leave." "You don't have to go," Ragnar replied quickly. "You look like you could use some—" "Please come inside and warm yourself." She shook her head, clutching her small bag closer to her chest. I can't. I don't want to be a burden." Ragnar's heart tightened. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke of deep pain, of a life that had not been kind. "You're not a burden," he said gently. "Please let me help you. It's too cold out here. You won't survive the night." After a long pause, the woman finally nodded, the fight seemingly draining out of her. Ragnar took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, guiding her through the gates and up the winding path to the mansion. As they walked, Ragnar noticed the way she shivered, her body trembling from the cold and exhaustion. When they reached the warmth of the mansion, Ragnar's longtime housekeeper Ingrid appeared, her face a mask of concern as she took in the sight of the woman. "Prepare some tea and something to eat," Ragnar instructed, "and draw a hot bath." Ingrid nodded and hurried away, leaving Ragnar alone with the woman in the grand foyer. The woman looked around, wide-eyed, as though she had stepped into another world. "What is your name?" Ragnar asked softly. "Edda," she replied, her voice still weak. "Edda? It's a beautiful name. I'm Ragnar." Edda offered a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Ragnar," she whispered. For helping me." "It's nothing," Ragnar said, though the truth was he felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Compassion, yes, but also a strange sense of connection. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about Edda that drew him in, something that made him want to protect her, to help her find whatever it was she had lost. Over the next few hours, Edda warmed herself by the fire, slowly regaining her strength. Ingrid brought her a tray of food, which she ate with the desperation of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Ragnar watched her quietly, his mind filled with questions, but he didn't press her for answers. There would be time for that later. When Edda had finished her meal, Ingrid led her to the bath that had been prepared, leaving Ragnar alone with his thoughts. He found himself wondering about the life that had brought Edda to his doorstep, about the demons she carried with her. He knew all too well the burden of carrying the past like a heavy cloak, weighing down every step, every breath. After what felt like an eternity, Edda returned, looking much more like a person than the shadow that had arrived at his gate. She was dressed in a simple but warm robe, her hair washed and combed, and for the first time Ragnar could see her clearly. She was not young, perhaps in her early 40s, but there was a beauty to her, a quiet strength that shone through the weariness in her. "Thank you, Ragnar," she said again, her voice stronger now. "You didn't have to do this." Ragnar shook his head. "Everyone deserves kindness, Edda, and sometimes we all need a little help." Edda's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I don't usually cry." "There's nothing to apologize for," Ragnar replied, his voice gentle. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Edda nodded, but said nothing more. Ragnar could sense that she wasn't ready to talk about it, so he didn't push. Instead, he offered her a room in the mansion for the night, assuring her that she could stay as long as she needed. Edda accepted the offer with quiet gratitude, and soon after, she retired to the guest room that Ingrid had prepared. As Ragnar watched her leave, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, a feeling that his life, so long defined by solitude and routine, was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. He didn't know why Edda had come into his life, but he had a feeling that it was no mere coincidence. Something deeper was at play, something that would soon reveal itself in the most unexpected of ways. And as the night deepened, Ragnar couldn't shake the feeling that his life, once so carefully controlled, was on the verge of being turned upside down, building trust and uncovering the past. The following morning, Ragnar awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window, a rare melody in the otherwise silent surroundings of his estate. He lingered in bed for a moment, recalling the events of the previous evening. Edda's arrival had stirred something within him, an inexplicable need to protect her, to understand the pain hidden behind her quiet demeanor. After dressing, Ragnar made his way to the kitchen, where Ingrid was already bustling about preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the scent of brewed coffee. "Good morning, Ingrid," Ragnar greeted as he entered. "Good morning, Mr. Crosby," Ingrid replied with a warm smile. "I've prepared breakfast for you and our guest." Ragnar nodded, his thoughts already on Edda. "Has she come down yet?" Ingrid shook her head. "Not yet, but I did hear some movement in her room earlier. I imagine she's still adjusting." Ragnar settled at the large oak table, his eyes drifting to the door. Moments later, Edda appeared, looking more rested but still carrying an air of weariness. She wore a simple dress Ingrid had found for her, and though it was modest, it did little to hide the dignity she carried, despite her circumstances. "Good morning," Ragnar greeted her, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Good morning," Edda replied softly, taking the offered seat. Her eyes flickered to the food laid out on the table, but she hesitated to reach for anything. "Please, help yourself," Ragnar encouraged. "You must be hungry." Edda gave a small nod and began to serve herself, though her movements were careful, almost tentative, as if she were afraid of taking too much. Ragnar watched her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She seemed like a woman who had been through a great deal, yet there was a strength in her that intrigued him. As they ate in silence, Ragnar's mind raced with questions. Who was Edda Lindström? What had driven her to the edge of despair, to the point where she had ended up at his gate? He wanted to know, but he also understood that such revelations couldn't be forced. Finally, Ragnar broke the silence. "Edda, I know we've only just met, but I'd like to offer you my help. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, you don't have to face it alone." Edda paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. For a moment, She seemed to struggle with her emotions, but then she set the fork down and met Ragnar's gaze. "I don't know where to begin," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Start wherever you feel comfortable," Ragnar said gently. "I'm here to listen." Edda took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I used to be an artist," she began slowly. "I painted landscapes, portraits, anything that inspired me. It was my passion, my life. But then I met Tore." Ragnar noticed the way her expression darkened at the mention of the name. "Tore?" he prompted softly. Edda nodded, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "He was charming, successful, and he saw potential in my work. He promised to help me make a name for myself, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. We fell in love, or at least I thought we did. We got married quickly, and that's when everything changed." Ragnar listened intently, sensing the pain behind her words. Edda continued, her voice growing steadier as she recounted her past. "Tor became controlling, manipulative. He wanted to shape my art, to mold it into something he could sell, something that would make him even more money. At first I went along with it, believing it was just part of the process. But soon it became clear that he didn't care about me or my art. He cared only about what I could do for him." Edda's gaze drifted to the window, as if she could see the memories playing out before her. "It got worse," she whispered. "He began to isolate me, cut me off from my friends, my family. He was possessive, jealous of anyone who might take my attention away from him. And when I tried to assert myself, to reclaim my art, he became violent." Ragnar's hands tightened into fists under the table, anger rising within him. He had seen the signs of abuse before, had witnessed the destruction it left in its wake. But he forced himself to remain calm, to focus on Edda's story. "One night, after he hurt me, I knew I had to leave," Edda continued, her voice breaking. "I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag with whatever I could carry and fled. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away." Tears welled in Edda's eyes, but she blinked them back, her expression resolute. "I've been on the run ever since, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere too long. I was terrified that Tore would find me, that he'd drag me back to that life. And then, after all this time, I ended up here, at your gate." Ragnar felt a pang of sympathy, but also a growing admiration for Edda. She had been through so much, yet she had survived. She had escaped the clutches of a man who sought to destroy her spirit, and now she was here, seeking refuge in the last place she had expected to find it. "You're safe here, Edda," Ragnar said softly. "Tor can't hurt you anymore." Edda looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But for how long?" she asked. "He's powerful, Ragnar. He has connections, resources. I'm afraid he'll find me, and when he does..." Ragnar reached across the table, taking Edda's hand in his. "He won't find you." "Not here, I'll make sure of it." Edda searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt, but found none. Slowly she nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." "You don't have to thank me," Ragnar replied, his voice filled with conviction. "I'm glad you're here, Edda, and I promise we'll figure this out together." As the days passed, Edda began to settle into life at the estate. Ragnar had offered her the guest house on the property, a quaint, cozy cottage surrounded by gardens that had long been left to grow wild. Edda took to the place immediately, finding comfort in the solitude it offered. She spent her days exploring the grounds, rediscovering her love for nature, and slowly the fear that had once gripped her heart began to loosen its hold. Ragnar, too, found himself changing. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years was now replaced by a sense of purpose. He took pleasure in Edda's company, in the conversations they shared over meals, in the quiet moments spent walking through the woods. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed having her around, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead. Hope. One afternoon, Ragnar found Edda sitting by the pond, a sketch pad in her lap. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but she looked up and smiled as he neared. "Do you mind if I join you?" Ragnar asked. "Not at all," Edda replied, gesturing to the spot beside her. Ragnar sat down, glancing at the sketchpad. "Are you drawing?" Edda nodded, a hint of shyness in her expression. "I've been trying to get back into it. It's been so long since I last sketched anything." "May I see?" Ragnar asked. Edda hesitated, then handed him the sketchpad. Ragnar studied the drawings, delicate lines that formed the shapes of trees, flowers, and the landscape around them. There was a raw beauty to her work, a sense of emotion that seemed to leap off the page. "These are wonderful, Edda," Ragnar said sincerely. "You have real talent." Edda blushed, taking the sketchpad back. "Thank you. It feels good to draw again, to create something. For so long I was afraid to even pick up a pencil." "I'm glad you're finding your way back to it," Ragnar said, his voice filled with warmth. "You should keep drawing, keep creating. You have a gift, Edda." Edda looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're the first person in a long time to believe in me, Ragnar. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Ragnar replied. "Just keep being who you are, that's all I ask." Edda smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I will," she promised. As the days turned into weeks, Ragnar and Edda grew closer. The bond between them deepened, built on trust and mutual respect. They shared their stories, their hopes and their fears, finding solace in each other's company. For Ragnar, it was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He no longer felt the crushing loneliness that had once defined his existence. And for Edda, it was the first time in years that she felt safe, that she felt she could truly be herself. But even as they forged a new life together, the shadow of Tore loomed over them. Edda knew that as long as he was out there, she could never truly be free. And so, one evening, as they sat by the fire, Edda made a decision. "Ragnar," she began, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I can't keep running forever. I need to face Tore, to confront him once and for all." Ragnar's expression darkened at the mention of Tore, but he nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "What do you?" he asked. "I want to end this," Edda replied, her eyes burning with resolve. "I want to expose him for who he truly is, to take back control of my life, but I can't do it alone. I need your help." Ragnar reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You have my help, Edda. Whatever you need, I'm with you." Edda smiled, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her. "Thank you, Ragnar. Together we can put an end to this nightmare." Little did they know, the path they were about to embark on would lead them to a revelation that would change everything, a truth buried deep in Ragnar's past, waiting to be uncovered, and when it finally surfaced, it would shake the very foundations of their lives, leaving them to grapple with a reality neither of them could have ever imagined. A plan takes shape. Over the next few days, Edda and Ragnar worked together to devise a plan. They knew that confronting Tore would be dangerous. He was a man with powerful connections and a ruthless streak, but Edda was determined, and Ragnar's resolve only strengthened with every passing day. He had lived too long in isolation, haunted by the ghosts of his past, to let fear hold him back now. They spent hours in Ragnar's study, poring over documents, making phone calls, and reaching out to people who could help. Ragnar's network was vast, and he used every resource at his disposal to gather information on Tore, his whereabouts, his associates, and his business dealings. Slowly, a picture began to form, revealing the extent of Tore's corruption and the lengths he had gone to keep Edda under his control. Edda, for her part, reconnected with people from her past, friends she had lost touch with during her years of hiding. She explained her situation, and though many were shocked to hear what she had been through, they offered their support. One of these friends was Viggo, a fellow artist who had once been close to Edda before Tore had driven them apart. Viggo had always admired Edda's talent, and when he heard of her plight, he immediately agreed to help. Viggo met with Ragnar and Edda at the estate, bringing with him a portfolio of Edda's early work, paintings she had created before Tore's influence had taken wholly. As they looked through the pieces, Edda felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with sadness. These paintings represented a time when she had been free, before her art had been twisted to suit Tore's demands. "These are incredible," Ragnar said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've always had a gift, Edda." Edda smiled faintly, tracing her fingers over the edge of one of the canvases. "Thank you, Ragnar. But these pieces, they feel like they belong to a different life, a different person." "Maybe it's time to reclaim that person," Viggo suggested gently, "to show the world who you really are, not who Tore tried to make you." Edda looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "You're right. I've spent too long hiding, too long letting him define me. It's time to take back my life." Together, they devised a plan to expose Tore's crimes and reclaim Edda's identity as an artist. They would organize an art exhibition, showcasing Edda's original work alongside new pieces that she had created since arriving at Ragnar's estate. The exhibition would serve as a statement, a declaration of her independence, and a challenge to Tore's control. Ragnar, with his extensive connections, arranged for the exhibition to be held at one of the most prestigious galleries in the city. He made sure that the event would attract the right kind of attention: critics, collectors, and journalists who could amplify Edda's story and bring Tore's actions into the spotlight. As the date of the exhibition approached, Edda threw herself into her work, spending hours in the studio that Ragnar had set up for her. She painted with a fervor she hadn't felt in years, pouring her emotions onto the canvas. Each brushstroke was an act of defiance, a reclaiming of her power. The pieces she created were raw, intense, and deeply personal, reflections of her journey from despair to hope. Ragnar watched her with a mixture of awe and pride. Edda's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. She had gone from a woman on the run, haunted by her past, to a force of nature determined to shape her own destiny. And in helping her, Ragnar found that he too was beginning to heal. The walls he had built around his heart were slowly crumbling, replaced by a sense of connection and purpose that he hadn't felt in decades. Finally, the night of the exhibition arrived. The gallery was a stunning space, with high ceilings, elegant lighting, and walls lined with Edda's paintings. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement as guests began to arrive, mingling and discussing the art on display. Edda stood nervously by the entrance, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress that Viggo had insisted she wear. Her hands trembled slightly as she greeted the first guests, but Ragnar was by her side, his reassuring presence helping to calm her nerves. "You've got this," Ragnar whispered to her as they entered the main hall. "You're going to be amazing." Edda nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thank you, Ragnar. I couldn't have done this without you." The gallery slowly filled with people, and Edda found herself the center of attention. Critics praised her work, collectors expressed interest in purchasing pieces, and journalists clamored for interviews. But through it all, Edda remained focused on her goal, to expose Tore and reclaim her life. As the evening wore on, Viggo approached Edda with a concerned expression. "Edda, I've just heard something," he said quietly. "Tore is here." Edda's heart skipped a beat. "What? How?" "He must have heard about the exhibition," Viggo replied. "He's in the crowd watching." Edda's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt a wave of fear wash over her. Tore was close, too close. But then she looked at Ragnar standing beside her and felt a surge of determination. "I'm not running anymore," Edda said, her voice steady. "Let him come." Ragnar's eyes flashed with concern, but he nodded, understanding her resolve. "I'm right here with you." As they made their way through the crowd, Edda spotted Tore standing near one of her paintings, his expression unreadable. He looked older than she remembered, his once handsome features hardened by years of deceit and manipulation, but the sight of him still sent a shiver down her spine. Tore turned as they approached, his gaze locking onto Edda. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick and palpable. "Edda," Tore finally said, his voice smooth but tinged with something darker. "I must say I'm impressed. I didn't think you had it in you to pull off something like this." Edda lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not the same person you knew, Tore. You can't control me anymore." Tore's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "We'll see about that," he said quietly. You're playing a dangerous game, Edda. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Before Edda could respond, Ragnar stepped forward, his presence commanding. She knows exactly what she's doing, he said firmly. And if you try to harm her in any way, you'll have to answer to me. Tor glanced at Ragnar, his eyes narrowing. And who are you exactly? The new protector? The knight in shining armor? I'm the man who won't let you destroy her, Ragnar replied coldly. You've done enough damage. It's over, Tor. Tor's lips curled into a sneer, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had always thrived on control, on bending others to his will, but now, faced with Edda's newfound strength and Ragnar's unwavering support, he realized that his hold over her was slipping. You think you've won, Tor said, his voice low and threatening. This isn't over. You can't escape your past, Edda. It will follow you wherever you go. Edda met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe, she said quietly, but I'm not afraid anymore, and I won't let you control me ever again. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Tor standing alone in the gallery. Ragnar followed close behind, his heart pounding with adrenaline. As they reached the other side of the room, Edda paused, taking a deep breath. That was intense, she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. Ragnar placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did great, Edda. You stood up to him, and you didn't let him intimidate you. Edda nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. I did, didn't I? I never thought I'd have the courage to face him again. You're stronger than you think, Ragnar said gently, and you're not alone. Edda's smile widened, and she leaned into Ragnar's embrace, finding comfort in his strength. But even as they stood together, a sense of unease lingered in the back of her mind. Tor was not a man to be underestimated, and she knew that he wouldn't give up easily. As the night drew to a close, the gallery slowly emptied, and Edda was left alone with her thoughts. The exhibition had been a success. Her work had been praised, her story had been told, and Tor's grip on her life had been weakened. But she knew that the battle was far from over. She returned to Ragnar's estate, exhausted but unable to sleep. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, each moment filled with tension and uncertainty. She had stood up to Tor, but the encounter had left her shaken, her old fears threatening to resurface. Ragnar found her in the living room, sitting by the fire, her expression troubled. He joined her on the couch, his presence offering a quiet reassurance. Can't sleep? He asked gently. Edda shook her head. I keep thinking about Tor, about what he might do next. Ragnar took her hand, holding it tightly. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this, Edda. Edda looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Ragnar. I don't know how I would have gotten through tonight without you. You don't have to thank me, Ragnar replied, his voice soft. I'm just glad I could be here for you. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. But as the warmth of the flames enveloped them, a sense of calm began to settle over Edda. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Ragnar by her side, and together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. But even as she found solace in Ragnar's presence, a new thought began to take shape in her mind, a thought that both intrigued and terrified her. There was something about Ragnar, something familiar yet elusive, as if their lives had been intertwined long before they had ever met. And as she drifted off to sleep, a nagging question lingered in the back of her mind. What if there was more to their connection than either of them realized? What if their paths had crossed for a reason that neither of them could have anticipated? Little did Edda know the answer to that question would soon reveal itself in the most unexpected and shocking way, one that would change everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The revelation. The days following the exhibition passed in a tense blur. Edda tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the encounter with Tor left a lingering unease that she couldn't shake. Ragnar remained vigilant, always nearby, offering comfort and support. Despite the success of the exhibition, they both knew that Tor's shadow still loomed large over their lives. One evening, Ragnar received a call that would set the stage for the revelation neither he nor Edda could have Antitiu. The call was from an old friend, a private investigator named Lars, whom Ragnar had enlisted to dig deeper into Tor's past. The conversation was brief, but the news was enough to send a chill down Ragnar's spine. "Ragnar," Lars said, his voice serious, "I've uncovered something you need to see. It's about Tore, and it's connected to you in ways I don't think you've considered." Ragnar's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean? How is it connected to me?" "I don't want to discuss it over the phone," Lars replied. "Come to my office tomorrow morning. I'll show you everything." Ragnar agreed, his mind racing with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. He didn't tell Edda about the call, not wanting to worry her until he knew more. But that night, as he lay in bed, his thoughts were consumed by what Lars might have discovered. Could it be that Tore's influence extended even further than they had imagined? And how could it possibly? The next morning, Ragnar made the drive to Lars's office, a small, nondescript building in the heart of the city. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle fell as Ragnar parked his car and entered the building. Inside, Lars was waiting for him, a stack of files spread out on his desk. "Ragnar," Lars greeted him with a somber expression. "Thanks for coming." "What have you found?" Ragnar asked, skipping the formalities. Lars gestured for him to sit down. "It's complicated, but I think it's B." Ragnar took a seat, his eyes fixed on the files. Lars picked up one of them and handed it to him. "This is a record of Tore's financial transactions over the past few years," Lars began. "I managed to trace some of his accounts, and what I found is troubling. He's been involved in more than just art forgery and fraud. There's evidence that he's been laundering money through various shell companies, some of which are tied to a corporation you might be familiar with, an old company called Crosby." Ragnar frowned. "Crosby Enterprises? That's the company I founded years ago. I sold it off when I retired." Lars nodded. "Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting, or rather, disturbing. One of the companies Tor has been using for his illegal activities is a subsidiary of Crosby Enterprises. He's been funneling money through it for years, and from what I can tell, it's how he's managed to keep his operations under the radar for so long." Ragnar's mind reeled as he processed the information. How could Tor have gotten his hands on one of his old companies? And why? What was his connection to Crosby Enterprises? "There's more," Lars continued, pulling out another file. "I dug deeper into Tor's background, into his history before he became involved with Edda. I found records of an adoption that took place over 50 years ago." Ragnar's heart began to pound in his chest. "An adoption?" Lars nodded. "Yes. Tor wasn't always Tore. His birth name was Andersson, and he was adopted by a wealthy couple when he was just an infant. The records are sparse, but I found something else, something that links him to you, Ragnar." Ragnar's throat tightened as he took the file from Lars's hands. Inside were copies of birth records, adoption papers, and a faded photograph of a baby boy. But it wasn't the baby that caught Ragnar's attention. It was the name of the birth parents listed on the adoption papers: Ingrid Crosby and Niels Anders. Ragnar felt the blood drain from his face as the realization hit him like a freight train. Ingrid Crosby, his mother. The name he hadn't heard in decades. The woman who had died when he was just a child. And Niels. Niels had been her lover, a man Ragnar had never known, but whose existence had always been a whispered secret in his family. "Tor is my brother?" Ragnar whispered, his voice barely audible. Lars nodded slowly. "Half-brother, technically. But yes, it appears so. Your mother had a child with Niels Andersson, a child who was put up for adoption shortly after birth. That child grew up to become the man we now know as Tore." Ragnar's mind spun as he tried to reconcile the truth with everything he knew, or thought he knew. Tor, the man who had tormented Edda, who had caused so much pain and suffering, was his own flesh and blood. The revelation was staggering, and for a moment Ragnar couldn't speak. How is this possible? Ragnar finally managed to see. How did he end up where he is now? Lars sighed. "It's a long story and one I don't have all the pieces to, but from what I've gathered, Tore Andersson was adopted by a wealthy couple, but things didn't go well. He ran away as a teenager, got involved in criminal activities, and eventually reinvented himself as Tor, the successful art dealer. He's been living under that alias ever since, hiding his true identity. Ragnar sat back in his chair, his thoughts a jumbled mess. Tor, his half-brother, the man who had brought so much darkness into Edda's life, was connected to him by blood. It was a connection that filled Ragnar with a deep, gnawing unease. "Does Edda know?" Ragnar asked, dreading the answer. Lars shook his head. "I don't believe she does. I found no evidence that Tore ever told her about his past, or his connection to you. But Ragnar, this changes everything. Tore may have been using his connection to your family to further his own agenda. He may have known about you all along." The thought sent a shiver down Ragnar's spine. Had Tore targeted Edda because of her connection to Ragnar? Was this all part of some twisted scheme, a way for Tor to exact revenge on the family that had abandoned him? "I need to talk to Edda," Ragnar said, his voice firm. "She deserves to know the truth." Lars nodded in agreement. "Be careful, Ragnar. Tor is dangerous, and now that you know the truth, you're both in more danger than ever." Ragnar left Lars's office with the files in hand, his mind heavy with the weight of the revelation. The drive back to the estate was a blur, his thoughts consumed by what he had just learned. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed the connection that had been right in front of him all along? When he arrived at the estate, Edda was waiting for him, her expression filled with concern. She could tell something was wrong, and Ragnar knew he couldn't keep the truth from her any lee. "Ragnar, what is it?" Edda asked as he walked into the living room. "What did Lars find?" Ragnar took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "Edda, there's something I need to tell you. Something that's going to change everything." Edda's eyes widened in alarm. "What is it? What did you find out?" Ragnar handed her the file, his hands trembling. "It's about Tore. He's not who we thought he was. He's my brother, Edda. My half-brother." Edda stared at him in disbelief, the color draw. "Your brother? How is that possible?" Ragnar quickly explained everything Lars had uncovered. The adoption, the connection to Crosby Enterprises, Tora's true identity. With each word, Edda's expression shifted from shock to horror, and finally to a deep, aching sadness. "I can't believe this," Edda whispered, her voice trembling. "All this time, he was your brother." Ragnar reached out to take her hand, his heart heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry, Edda. I had no idea." "If I had known..." Edda shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "This changes everything, Ragnar. Tor, he's part of your family. How can we fight him now, knowing that?" Ragnar's grip tightened on her hand. "It doesn't matter who he is, Edda. He's hurt you and he's done terrible things. We can't let him get away with it." Edda looked at him, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. "But he's your brother. How can you stand against him?" "So because you mean more to me than anything," Ragnar replied, his voice filled with conviction. "Blood doesn't excuse what he's done, and I won't let him hurt you, or anyone else, ever again." Edda's tears spilled over, and she threw her arms around Ragnar, holding him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for standing by me, even after everything." Ragnar held her close, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. The revelation had shattered the world they had known, but it had also brought them closer together. They were no longer just two people fighting their own battles. They were partners, bound by a shared resolve to overcome the darkness that had tried to consume them. As they stood together, holding each other in the quiet of the room, Ragnar knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Tore was still out there, and he would not give up easily. But they had each other, and that gave Ragnar hope. No matter what came next, they would face it together. But even as they found strength in each other, a new question began to loom over them. What would happen when they finally confronted Tore? What would be revealed when brother faced brother, and the full truth of their shared past came to light? The answer would come soon enough, and when it did, it would change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The final confrontation. The days following the revelation were filled with a 10. Edda and Ragnar spent countless hours discussing their next steps, trying to navigate the emotional minefield that had been laid before them. The knowledge that Tore was Ragnar's half-brother weighed heavily on both of them, complicating their resolve to bring him to justice. But despite the newfound complexity of their situation, one thing remained clear. Tor needed to be stopped. The crimes he had committed, the lives he had destroyed, including Edda's, could not be ignored. Ragnar knew that blood ties could not excuse Tore's actions, and Edda knew that confronting Tore was the only way she could truly reclaim her life. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Ragnar received another call from Lars. The investigator's voice was tense, his words laced with urgency. "Ragnar, we've tracked down Tore," Lars said. "He's staying at a remote property just outside the city. It seems he's gone to ground, but he's not alone. He's hired security, likely to protect himself, but also to prepare for whatever he's planning next." Ragnar's jaw tightened. "Do we know what he's planning?" "Not yet," Lars admitted, "but given everything we've uncovered, it's likely that he's preparing for a final move. Something big, something that could cause a lot of damage. You need to act quickly, Ragnar. This may be your only chance to stop him." Ragnar thanked Lars for the information and hung up, his mind already racing with possibility. He turned to Edda, who had been listening intently, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "This is it," Ragnar said quietly. "We have to confront him now, before he can do any more harm." Edda nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. "I'm ready, Ragnar. Let's end this." They quickly formulated a plan, knowing that there was no time to waste. Ragnar contacted Viggo, who agreed to accompany them, offering both his support and his own connections. They would confront Tor at his hideout, forcing him to face the consequences of his actions. It was a dangerous move, but one that felt necessary. They could not allow Tor to continue manipulating and destroying lives. The next morning, under the cover of dawn, Ragnar, Edda and Viggo set out for Tor's hideout. The drive was long and tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken fears and unyielding determination. The remote property was located in a forested area, far from prying eyes. As they approached, Ragnar noticed the heavy presence of security. Men with grim expressions, clearly prepared for trouble. Viggo, who had taken the lead in arranging their approach, suggested a diversion to draw the guards away from the main building. It was a risky move, but one that they hoped would give them the opportunity to confront Tore directly. Ragnar and Edda agreed, knowing that this might be their only chance to face him. As Viggo executed the diversion, Ragnar and Edda slipped past the guards, making their way to the main house. The property was large and imposing, a fortress-like structure that reflected the paranoia and ruthlessness of its owner. Ragnar's heart pounded in his chest as they entered the building, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. They moved through the house with caution, each step bringing them closer to the confrontation they had been preparing for. Finally, they reached a large room at the back of the house, a room that appeared to serve as Tore's office. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Ragnar could see Tore seated at a large desk, his back to them. Taking a deep breath, Ragnar pushed the door open and stepped inside, Edda close behind him. Tore looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable as he saw them standing there. For a moment, there was silence, the air heavy with anticipation. "So," Tore said finally, his voice cold and controlled, "you've found me." Ragnar took a step forward, his eyes locked on Tore. "This ends now, Tore. We know everything. The truth about who you are, what you've done. It's over." Tore's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Is that what you think? That you can just walk in here and dictate terms? You have no idea what you're dealing with, Ragnar. You've spent your life hiding in your ivory tower, thinking you're untouchable. But the world doesn't work. It's brutal, unforgiving, and those who survive are the ones who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." Ragnar's expression hardened. "I'm not afraid of you, Tore, and I'm not afraid to face the truth. You've hurt too many people, and it stops here." Tore leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "And what do you plan to do? Turn me into the authorities? Expose me? I have more power and influence than you realize, Ragnar. You can't touch me." Edda, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "This isn't just about power, Tor. This is about the lives you've destroyed. You took everything from me, my art, my freedom, my sense of self. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. You can't control me." Tor's gaze shifted to Edda, and for a moment, a flicker of something passed over his face. Regret, perhaps, or something darker. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. "How you think you can break free from me?" Tor said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're nothing without me, Edda. Everything you've accomplished, everything you are, it's because of me. I made you." Edda's eyes blazed with anger, but before she could respond, Ragnar spoke again, his voice filled with quiet fury. "You didn't make her, Tor. You tried to break her, to mold her into something that suited your twisted desires, but you failed. She's stronger than you could ever imagine, and she's no—" Torre's expression darkened, and he rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "You really think you can defeat me, Ragnar? You're nothing more than a relic of a past that no longer matters. I've built an empire, one that you can't even begin to comprehend. And now you come here thinking you can take it all away. You're a fool." Ragnar held his ground, his voice steady. "The only fool here is you, Tor. You've spent your life chasing power, but in the end, it's left you with naught. No family, no real connections, just the hollow shell of a man who's destroyed everything he's touched." Tor's eyes flashed with rage, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then, something in his demeanor shifted. The anger in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You're wrong, Ragnar," Tor said quietly. "I'm not the one who's lost everything. You are. And by the time this is over, you'll understand just how far I'm willing to go to get what I want." Before Ragnar or Edda could react, Tor reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small silver handgun. The room seemed to freeze as he pointed the weapon at Ragnar, his hand steady, his eyes locked on his brother's. "Ragnar!" Edda gasped, her voice filled with fear. But Ragnar didn't flinch. He looked into Tor's eyes, seeing the madness that had driven him for so many years. This was the man who had caused so much pain, who had ruined lives without a second thought. And now here they were facing each other for what could be the final time. "You think this will solve anything, Tor?" Ragnar asked, his voice calm despite the danger. "Killing me won't change what you've done. It won't give you the power you crave. It will only prove that you've lost everything." Tor's hand wavered, the gun shaking slightly. For a moment it seemed as though Ragnar's words had reached him, had pierced through the armor of bitterness and hate. But then, with a look of grim determination, Tor steadied the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, as the world seemed to hold its breath, a loud crash echoed through the room. Viggo burst through the door, his eyes wide with alarm as he took in the scene before him. Without hesitation, he lunged at Tor, tackling him to the ground just as the gun went off. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space, but it went wide, embedding itself harmlessly in the wall. Ragnar and Edda watched in stunned silence as Viggo wrestled the gun from Tor's grasp, pinning him to the floor with a strength born of desperation. Tor struggled, cursing and shouting, but Viggo held him down, his face twisted with anger. "It's over, Tor!" Viggo yelled. "You're finished!" Tor's resistance weakened, and finally he lay still, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fight had drained out of him, leaving him a broken man on the floor. Viggo kept him pinned, not taking any chances, while Ragnar quickly called Lars and the authorities. The minutes that followed were a blur. The police arrived, arresting Tor and taking him away in handcuffs. He didn't resist, his eyes vacant, his spirit seemingly crushed. As they led him out of the house, Tor looked back at Ragnar and Edda one last time, his expression unreadable. And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt both heavy and liberating. As the police cleared the scene, Ragnar and Edda stood together, their hands clasped tightly. Viggo, his breathing still heavy from the struggle, approached them, a look of relief on his face. "Are you both okay?" Viggo asked, his voice filled with concern. Ragnar nodded, squeezing Edda's hand. "Thanks to you, Viggo. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did." Edda turned to Viggo, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Viggo. You saved our lives." Viggo waved off their thanks, a modest smile on his face. "I'm just glad I got here in time. Tor, he's a dangerous man. But it's over now. You're safe." The reality of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. Tor was gone, and with him, the threat that had loomed over Edda's life for so long. It was over. Truly over. The weight of that realization was almost overwhelming, and Edda felt tears welling in her eyes. Ragnar pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as the emotions she had been holding back finally spilled over. They had faced the darkness together, and they had come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. In the days that followed, life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything they had been through. Tor was charged with multiple crimes, including attempted murder, and it was clear that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The media picked up the story, and soon Tor's name became synonymous with scandal and disgrace. But for Ragnar and Edda, the focus was no longer on Tor. Their thoughts were on the future, on the life they could now build together, free from the shadows of the past. They returned to the estate where Edda continued to paint, finding solace and joy in her art once more. Ragnar, too, found a new sense of purpose. The revelation of Tor's true identity had shaken him to his core, but it had also brought him closer to Edda. In her, he had found not just a companion, but someone who understood the complexities of his past and the pain that came with it. Together, they began to rebuild, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together on the veranda, watching the sun set over the mountains, Ragnar turned to Edda, his expression serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Ragnar said, his voice filled with emotion. "After everything we've been through, after everything that's happened, I realize now that I don't want to spend another day without you in my life. Edda, will you marry me?" Edda looked at him, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, she was speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of Ragnar's love for her. And then, with tears streaming down her face, she nodded. "Yes, Ragnar," she whispered, her voice filled with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ragnar's heart soared as he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as they both let the happiness of the moment wash over them. The future they had fought so hard to secure was now within their grasp, and together, they would build a life filled with love, trust, and the promise of new beginnings. As they held each other, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the mountains, they knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. But they also knew that they could face anything, as long as they were together. And so, in the quiet of the evening, Ragnar and Edda began the next chapter of their lives, one that was no longer defined by the pain of the past, but by the hope of a brighter future. What would you do if you discovered that the person who hurt you the most was actually connected to you by blood? Would you be able to forgive, or would you choose to walk away? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and tell us what you would do in Ragnar and Edda's shoes. Remember, your support helps us continue to bring you these emotional and thought-provoking tales. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.